Good morning. Cool. It is a pleasure and an honor to be with you this morning. It's quite the privilege to share with you our model, a model that I believe can provide quality opportunity for men and women in the streets of Black and brown America. So what are the streets? What do I actually mean by this language? Well, in short, I mean low-income people, primarily in Black and brown communities, that are caught up in the criminal justice system. Also, and or more specifically, I may mean those persons, for instance, that are caught up in the drug trade or gang activity or armed robbery, for example. Also, I'm a phenomenological researcher, which means I privilege and use and value the language of the population that I study through my analysis. And they oftentimes refer to it as the streets, so I now frame my analysis through that language, their assumptions, or their arguments, or through their worldview. Also, I've concluded from my analysis that the streets are at least three other things. The streets are physical spaces or locations. The streets are activity-based, illegal or legal behavior. And the streets are a source of identity, at least for those who embrace it in that way. Street life or a street identity is grounded in the ideology of personal, social, and economic survival. Men and women in the streets of Black and brown America often come to this way of life and or this worldview as a site of resilience. Contrary to popular arguments raised by my colleagues in the social science literature, they are resilient. Put simply, they come to the streets as a way to provide, as a way to survive, as a way to cope, or as a way to make it. Walk with me is phenomenological or colloquial language made popular by rappers DMX, Big Stan, and Sheek Louch. When they say walk with me, they mean the only ways that professionals and others can effectively assist those that are caught up in the criminal justice system is by literally and figuratively walking with those persons that may be street identified, to more deeply understand their lived experiences. We must begin to develop interventions with them, the streets, not in spite of them. We must begin to find safe ways to observe the vicious structural conditions that work to create and shape a street identity. And then we must be brave enough to allow those observations to inform our notions of help. So walk with me this morning as I share with you a model that I know can help so many people. I was born in Harlem, New York City, and I often argue that my work is born out of or motivated by my biography, right? Surprise, surprise. I was born in Harlem, New York City. I was also raised in both Harlem, New York, and North New Jersey. My parents, while very loving and very caring, and I mean that, they too were involved in the streets. In fact, all three of my older brothers, who were very caring and very loving, and I mean that, they also were involved in the streets. And also, I must confess or admit that for a small period of time, at least in my former life, I also was involved in the streets. And anyone would tell you that life in the streets consists of a set of erratic experiences. Life in the streets are steeped in highs and lows. So as a child, my parents owned some of the biggest businesses on 125th Street and 7th Avenue in Harlem, New York City. And then there also came a time where we lost those stores, and we instead became street peddlers in front of those same businesses. And as you might imagine, as a child, sometimes at least, I was angry, having to sometimes sit there for 10 to 12 hours a day, sometimes in extremely hot or humid weather, sometimes in extremely cold weather. And oftentimes, in my fit of frustration and anger, I would sit there at those stands on those unforgiving crates, and sometimes I would ask the question mostly to myself, but I would obsess over the question, and I would ask, how could we as a society so willingly tolerate how extreme poverty sits next to extreme wealth? How could we be so indifferent? And I would obsess over this question at those stands or in those crates. At those stands, I had a number of positive and negative experiences, a number of observations, right? A number of things that I saw or witnessed or observed. And it's important to underscore that there were a number of positive experiences in places like Central Harlem. Keep in mind, Harlem taught me there was nothing more important than the community. Harlem taught me that people are powerful. Harlem taught me that there was nothing more important than the connection to the individual or to the group and or to the neighborhood. Harlem taught me that. And that value has served me well. There are a number of negative experiences also at the peddling stands that equally informed my worldview. So, for instance, while sitting at those stands, I observed a number of homeless people. Sometimes it would feel as if they were walking around in droves. At those stands, I witnessed a number of men and women use and sell narcotics just to make it to the next day, financially or emotionally. At those stands, sometimes I saw individuals physically assaulted in some of the worst ways imaginable. And I even saw one gentleman beat to death at those stands. So after having all of these positive and negative experiences informing my worldview, I decided one day, right, that I found my calling in my young teenage years, sitting on those crates at those stands. I had decided that I would dedicate my life to assisting and helping those however I could who were caught up in the criminal justice system. I had come to that revelation at those stands. I now began to ask a second question in my newfound passion. Although a naive question, but I still obsessed over that question too. Now I wanted to know, with my newfound passion, what programs existed that aggressively sought to transition them, the streets, from economic poverty to quality opportunity. Where were those programs? Why weren't more individuals or organizations thinking in this direction? I would obsess over. And all of these experiences led me one day to eventually create a research activist methodology entitled Street PAR, or Street Participatory Action Research. Street PAR extends out of the traditional PAR model. PAR is an acronym, P-A-R, and it stands for Participatory Action Research. PAR projects require researchers to include on the research team members of the population under study. And they should be included in all phases of the research project, be it the development of the theoretical framework, design, analysis. They should be included as co-authors of manuscripts. They should be included as presenters of the data. And not only that, but they should be monetarily compensated for their time. Uh-oh. It's the graduate student model, but we're just moving it to the street corner. PAR projects also require that an action or an activism dimension be organized in relation to the data analyzed in the study. Street PAR explicitly organizes individuals who do embrace or who have embraced street life as a central identity, right? And the goal is to organize those individuals to empirically document the lived experiences of other persons or groups that may be active in the streets. The assumption behind Street PAR is that folks or persons who have some experiences in the criminal justice system are best poised to critically examine the culture of people who come from this lifestyle. The People's Report was organized by a robust institutional partnership, inclusive of 4 nonprofit organizations and 3 universities. The People's Report was organized out of the South Bridge and East Side neighborhoods of Wilmington, Delaware. And this project was charged with the task of examining notions of physical violence in the city of Wilmington. Wilmington, Delaware, the largest city in Delaware, holds approximately 71,000 people, predominantly Black or African American. Wilmington is sharply segregated by race or class, like most cities. So in certain pockets of the city, you can see whiter or wealthier populations. In other areas of the city, you can see Blacker, browner, and or poorer parts of the population. Also, Wilmington has one of the biggest banking districts in the country. So you can see lots of examples of extreme wealth sitting side by side with extreme poverty in the city of Wilmington. Wilmington also has one of the highest homicide per capita rates. Some folk may not know, but our homicide per capita rate, particularly in 2010, the year in which we broke our homicide record, was higher than most big cities. So that means our per capita rate was higher than places like Philadelphia, Baltimore, New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. The partnership decided to identify 15 residents from the community. The 15 residents were formerly involved with the streets and or the criminal justice system. Their ages spanned between 20 and 48, and there were 12 men and 3 women. The 15 were trained in 18 research methods workshops across a 2-month period. Each workshop ranged between 3 to 5 hours, and there were no more than 3 workshops per week. And the curriculum for the workshop was grounded in discussions and readings on theory, design, analysis, and activism. And we did not water it down. This was a graduate student experience. At the end of the training, our research question was, to what extent does available economic and educational opportunity predict violence in these 2 neighborhoods? Right? So our data collection team, we were successful. We were fortunate enough to be successful to collect 520 surveys from mostly street-identified Black men and women between the ages of 18 to 35 in these 2 neighborhoods. The data collection team went out for the most part during the summer of 2010, and we went out for the most part between the hours of 7 p.m. and 1 a.m. at night. Right? And we went to hot sites where a lot of criminal activities take place. We also went to warm sites and cool sites as well. And you can find members of the population there as well. We approached participants, gave them an 18-page survey. Surveys on average, keep in mind that the surveys were co-designed by the 15 residents. Surveys on average took approximately 30 minutes to complete. And upon completion, participants received $5 in cash, information on employment, schooling opportunities, and counseling services. And also information in counseling services, and they also received a copy of their consent form. So what did we find? And we found a lot. Strong presence of structural violence and inequality. But the first, yes, a profound loss of opportunity. From our study, we found that nearly 70%, nearly 70% of the men in these neighborhoods between the ages of 18 and 35 are unemployed. And nearly 62% of the women, most of whom were actively looking for work. We've also found at the time of the study that 100% of all Black boys in the Southbridge neighborhood were dropping out of high school. Jesus. We also found high levels of exposure to physical violence. I saw or I heard someone get assaulted or robbed. We found not as high as expected levels of experiences with physical violence. That means I was assaulted or robbed. Right? So we found high levels of unemployment, high levels of dropout rates, high levels of poor schooling opportunities, high levels of exposure to physical violence, not as high levels as expected with experiences with physical violence. So now we're dealing with these 2 constructs of violence, of opportunity and violence, and we also found that economic well-being was predictive of experiences with violence. So that as economic well-being became more negative, experiences with physical violence increased in this sample. And third, we found, strangely enough, between opportunity and violence, we found a mostly street-identified sample demonstrating high levels of psychological and social well-being. Wow. Or put another way, a mostly street-identified sample scored really high in terms of their self-esteem, scored really high in terms of their love for their family or the group, and scored really high in terms of their commitment to the local neighborhood. That's why we need them to do the research, because they radically reframe the analysis. So what about those street PAR members? What about those 15? What do we find with them? Well, really fast with respect to employment, we can proudly say that all 15 received some form of quality economic or employment, and usually between $15 and $20 an hour. That's what we mean by quality. Presently, 12 of the PAR members, street PAR members, are employed, and also with respect to education, 6 enrolled in college during and after the initial funding period, and 2 of those 6 enrolled in graduate school, one of which is Darrell Chambers, and those same 2 completed their Masters of Arts degrees, and those same 2 are now pursuing their doctorates. Wow. It's important to underscore that we took action very seriously, and one of the ways you can do action is through the arts. So we organized 2 street art exhibitions centered on the theme of the relationship between inequality and crime. The second exhibition, we were able to identify 50 artists, mostly from Black and Brown Wilmington, and they contributed approximately 270 pieces of art. Wow. All around the theme of inequality and crime. Now just imagine that exhibition. And or based on our data, we're able to make 17 recommendations, and I can honestly say that our recommendations received a lot of attention from civic and political leadership. In closing, we can teach them, and we can be taught by them. We can do this from our respective professional capacities. We can equip them with a reading, writing, data analysis, and activist skill set. We can do this. And they want us to do this. They want us to organize these types or kinds of empowering opportunities. The model that I shared with you today offers a real shot at transformation. It offers a real opportunity for street-identified persons to transition into upward mobility. Let me be clear. We reject programs that are solely grounded in cognitive and behavioral change. We reject programs for this population that are solely grounded in crude philosophies of personal responsibility. And we reject programs that are solely grounded in low opportunity outcomes, like job training programs that for the most part are at best produce minimum wage employment and oftentimes no employment at all. For us, these programs work to sustain this population in economic poverty. For us, these programs ultimately work to sustain this population in a vicious cycle with the criminal justice system. In fact, we call for interventions to be created and developed within the context of personal and communal empowerment. However, a context must be provided so that empowerment is actually possible. And as the science supports, ours and otherwise, men and women from the streets of Black and Brown America, they want a part of the middle American dream. As the science supports, they want to work, they want to go to school, including college, and they want to give back to their neighborhoods in positive ways. It's time that we believe in our youth and young adults again. It's imperative that we do not lose faith in our young people. Thank you for your time.